Tonight, I want to share something most people miss. Not because it's hidden, but because avoidant personalities are extremely good at making it look like it doesn't matter. There's a deeper emotional reason why avoidants often seem to fall apart after an empath finally goes quiet. And it usually happens right at the moment the avoidant thinks they've regained control. Avoidants and empaths are emotionally opposite. One feels deeply and stays connected. The other shuts down feelings to protect themselves. At first, this creates a strange kind of balance. The empath gives warmth, patience, understanding, and emotional effort. The avoidant pulls back, stays distant, and protects themselves through silence and detachment. But over time, that balance becomes uneven. The empath keeps holding the emotional weight of the relationship, trying to understand, forgive, and stay present. The avoidant becomes used to this dynamic and slowly depends on it without realizing it. What they don't see is that the empath's emotional presence is what has been keeping things stable. The empathy, patience, and consistency act like emotional support that softens the avoidant's fear and inner emptiness. It allows them to feel connected without truly opening up. It gives them reassurance without requiring vulnerability in return. So the avoidant starts to assume this will always be there. They believe the empath will keep returning no matter how much they withdraw. They think distance has no real cost. Then something changes. The empath becomes quiet. Not out of anger, not as punishment, but from exhaustion. A quiet withdrawal that simply says, "I can't carry this alone anymore." At first, the avoidant doesn't fully react. They assume it's temporary. They expect things to reset like before. But as the silence continues, something unfamiliar starts to surface inside them. The emotional stability they didn't know they relied on begins to disappear. And this is where the internal collapse starts. Avoidants often believe distance is strength. They think staying detached protects them. But when the empath stops giving emotional energy, that distance turns into isolation. What once felt like control starts to feel like emptiness. Without the empath's presence, there is no emotional buffer anymore. No patience absorbing their withdrawal. No warmth balancing their coldness. No connection quietly holding things together in the background. What remains is everything they avoided dealing with for years. Their insecurities, fear of closeness, emotional wounds, and need for connection all rise to the surface at once. And because they are not used to facing these feelings, it becomes overwhelming. This collapse doesn't happen loudly. It happens in silence. They start to feel the absence more than they expected. They begin to miss the emotional safety they once took for granted. They feel a kind of longing they tried to deny, and slowly they realize the connection meant more than they admitted to themselves. They thought the empath's presence was guaranteed. They thought they had more control than they actually did. But now, with the silence stretching on, they are forced to face the emotional cost of their distance. The collapse is not just about losing the empath. It's about losing the emotional structure the empath was holding in place all along. The feeling of being understood, supported, and emotionally anchored without having to fully engage. And when that structure disappears, the avoidant is left alone with the emotions they spent their life avoiding. Even silence, which once felt like safety to them, stops working the same way. It no longer protects them. Instead, it reflects them back to themselves. And in that reflection, they finally feel what was always being held beneath the surface. In their mind, silence feels like power. It feels like control over emotions, over the situation, and over how close or distant the relationship becomes. As long as they can stay silent, they believe they are protecting themselves from the discomfort that love can bring. And for a long time, it seems to work. Because the empath fills the gaps. Every time silence shows up, the empath responds with connection. They reach out, they explain, they soften the distance, and they try to rebuild what's missing. When the avoidant pulls away, the empath moves closer. When the avoidant withdraws into quiet, the empath speaks love into that quiet space. So over time, the avoidant starts to believe something without realizing it. They start to think silence is strength. They think it keeps them safe without any real cost. They assume the connection will survive no matter what, because the empath will always be the one to carry the emotional effort. But then something shifts. The empath becomes silent too. Not out of indifference, not as a way to hurt them, but because they've reached their emotional limit. Empaths don't withdraw easily. They only go quiet when they are exhausted from speaking into emptiness, when they realize their feelings are no longer being received, or when loving someone starts to feel like losing themselves instead of growing. And when that happens, the avoidant's entire understanding of emotional control begins to break down. The silence that once felt safe suddenly feels unfamiliar. It no longer feels like control. It feels like loss. It feels heavy, like something pressing on their chest. What used to be comfortable distance now turns into emotional discomfort they can't ignore. Because the empath's silence is not empty. It carries meaning. It carries boundaries. It carries truth. It quietly says, "I won't chase anymore. I have given what I can. This distance is no longer yours to control." And in that moment, something becomes clear to the avoidant that they never wanted to see. Their silence was never real strength. It was fear disguised as control. They were never fully holding the relationship together through distance. They were depending on the empath's consistency, patience, and emotional effort to keep the connection alive in the background. Now that support is gone, there is no emotional buffer anymore. No reassurance arriving after withdrawal. No warmth repairing the distance. No one regulating the emotional imbalance. And what's left is something they've avoided facing for a long time. Themselves. Loneliness starts to surface. So does insecurity. So does longing. And even regret. Feelings they once pushed down begin to rise without anything to soften them. The silence becomes louder than arguments ever were. Louder than avoidance. Louder than emotional suppression. Because now, it is no longer something they are choosing. It is something being experienced by them. And that loss of control hits the deepest part of their fear. Because they can control their own withdrawal. They can choose when to step back, but they cannot control the empath doing the same. And that is what breaks the illusion. Avoidants often build their identity around escaping emotional discomfort. They learn to shut down, detach, and disconnect when things feel too intense. These patterns are not random. They are built from early emotional experiences, reinforced over time, and carried into adulthood like protection. But that protection only works as long as someone else is still engaging emotionally. As long as the empath is speaking, explaining, forgiving, and trying, the avoidant doesn't have to fully look inward. They don't have to sit with their fears or face the emotional gaps they carry. They can keep running from themselves because the relationship is still being held together by someone else. When the empath goes quiet, that support disappears. There is no emotional noise left to hide behind, no reassurance to lean on, no comforting presence to absorb the impact of their withdrawal. No one left to repair what was never addressed. And in that silence, the avoidant is left alone with what they have been avoiding all along. Their fears, their insecurities, their emotional wounds, and the uncomfortable truth that they are not as detached as they believed. Because what they were running from was never just the relationship. It was themselves. Facing the parts of themselves that were never truly seen or emotionally held means confronting a deeper pain they usually avoid. The parts that never felt loved, never felt safe, never felt protected, and never felt good enough. It also means sitting with a painful inner belief they rarely admit out loud, that they are not deserving of closeness, that vulnerability is risky, and that real intimacy eventually ends in abandonment. While the empath is still present, offering warmth, patience, emotional softness, and consistent connection, the avoidant doesn't have to face any of this directly. The empath becomes a kind of emotional buffer, quietly absorbing the impact of distance and keeping the connection alive through understanding and effort. Without even realizing it, the avoidant leans on that emotional strength as protection. But real silence changes everything. Not the silence they create, the silence they receive. Because true silence removes the emotional cushion they were relying on. It brings everything they have been avoiding into focus. It reveals the emotional emptiness that was being covered up by constant connection, attention, and reassurance. And once that support disappears, they are forced to sit with what they've been running from for years. In that stillness, emotions start to rise all at once. Fear, loneliness, guilt, regret, confusion, longing, and old wounds they never fully processed. These feelings don't arrive gently because they were never addressed gradually. They were pushed down, ignored, or avoided for a long time, while the empath quietly helped regulate the emotional space between them. Now that voice, that presence, that steady emotional support is gone, and the avoidant is left alone with their internal chaos. Silence becomes a mirror. It reflects back the distance they created, the emotional coldness they leaned on, and the pain they unintentionally caused. More than anything, it forces them to see a truth they tried not to face. The person who understood them, accepted them, and kept showing up emotionally is no longer reaching for them. And that realization hits harder internally than anything they usually show outwardly. Because even if they don't express emotions easily, they still feel them deeply, just in a delayed and internal way. When the empath becomes silent, their usual coping strategies stop working the same way. Distraction loses its effect. Emotional justification no longer feels convincing. Blame doesn't hold up anymore because there is no emotional reaction left to respond to. Even the idea of needing space starts to feel different because now that space feels empty instead of relieving. In that quiet, something becomes clear. They weren't only avoiding the relationship, they were avoiding their own emotional vulnerability. And now that avoidance has caught up with them, the silence exposes what was hidden beneath the surface. Not just emotional distance, but emotional immaturity, fear of closeness, and the cost of choosing protection over connection. It also reveals how much the connection actually meant, even if they never fully acknowledged it. This is where the internal collapse begins. Not in drama or confrontation, but in private thought, in reflection, in the uncomfortable stillness of being alone with themselves. For someone who built their identity around escaping emotional discomfort, this moment feels destabilizing. Because there is no longer anyone to redirect the emotion toward, no one to soften it, no one to absorb it, no one to maintain the emotional balance they depended on without realizing it. The empath's presence had been the emotional anchor holding things steady, even if it was never consciously appreciated. Once that anchor is gone, they start drifting into thoughts they can no longer avoid. And this is why empath silence becomes so powerful. It doesn't just remove communication, it removes emotional support, emotional cushioning, and emotional excuses all at once. What remains is direct exposure to self. Avoidant patterns often form around the expectation that emotional distance will be met with pursuit. That withdrawal will be followed by chasing, explaining, fixing, or reassuring. That cycle creates a sense of control because it allows them to step back while still being emotionally followed. But when the empath stops chasing, the entire structure collapses. Not because of anger, not because of punishment, but because of acceptance. Calm, steady acceptance that the pattern is no longer sustainable. That kind of peace is unfamiliar to the avoidant, because it doesn't invite reaction, it doesn't demand repair, it doesn't create emotional urgency. It simply reflects reality back as it is. And that is what makes it so difficult to process, because pursuit makes them feel important, even without vulnerability. But peace removes that dynamic completely. It shows that the connection is no longer dependent on their presence, their distance, or their response. And in that realization, something deeper surfaces. The fear that without being pursued, they may not feel chosen at all. The silence reveals how much emotional meaning the empath actually provided. It shows that what felt like control was actually dependence on someone else's emotional effort. And when that effort stops, the illusion breaks. What they once called strength begins to feel like avoidance. What they called independence starts to feel like emotional disconnection. And what they assumed was safety reveals itself as distance from intimacy. Once that truth becomes clear, there is nowhere left to escape into. No more emotional noise, no more responses to manage, no more dynamic to rely on. Just themselves and everything they were trying not to feel. And in that space, the cost of avoidance finally becomes visible. Not immediately, not loudly, but clearly enough that it cannot be ignored anymore. They often mistake the empath's patience for dependence, as if staying longer means they cannot leave. In their mind, it creates a false belief that the empath will always remain, always forgive, always give more than what is fair. They start to assume that unconditional love means endless tolerance, no matter how much emotional distance they create. But what they don't understand is that the empath's love was never infinite. It was simply giving. And even giving has limits the avoidant never expected to reach, until the moment's silence finally replaced patience. When the empath detaches, it never happens suddenly. It is not born from revenge or anger. It builds slowly, after repeated moments of being ignored, dismissed, or taken for granted. It comes after every attempt to connect has been met with distance, and after every effort to understand has gone unreturned. By the time the empath steps back, it is not punishment. It is clarity. A calm, settled truth that they can no longer keep pouring into something one-sided. And that silence becomes something the avoidant was never prepared to face. It turns into a mirror. It reflects everything they avoided looking at before. The emotional impact of their distance, the pain caused by their withdrawal, and the quiet damage created by their fear of closeness. With no more reaching out from the empath, the avoidant can no longer hide behind the comforting belief that they were never truly loved. Because now, they remember the truth. Someone did love them, deeply, patiently, without conditions. Someone tried to understand their inner world, offered emotional safety, and stayed present even when it wasn't easy. And still, they pulled away. In the silence, it becomes clear that they were not abandoned by love. They stepped away from it. They created the very distance they now feel the weight of. And that realization doesn't arrive gently. It lands quietly, but with emotional force. The avoidant begins to replay everything. The moments they ignored affection, the times they brushed off emotional effort, the messages they left unanswered, the patience they misunderstood, the closeness they were offered but didn't fully receive. And slowly, those memories start to feel different. It's as if they are seeing them for the first time, without the defenses they once used to explain them away. They begin to understand something they missed in the moment. The empath didn't stop loving them when things were difficult. The empath kept showing up, even when walls were built between them. Even when fear created distance, the care was still there. And that realization cuts deeper than any conflict ever could. Because the truth is no longer about losing someone, it becomes about understanding why they were lost. Not because love disappeared, but because it was not fully received. Not because it was too much, but because too little was given back in return. Silence exposes that the avoidant was never pushed away. They gradually stepped away themselves. And seeing that truth clearly is far more painful than any argument or breakup. This collapse doesn't happen loudly. It happens internally, quietly, in the background of ordinary moments, in late nights, in still mornings, in thoughts that return without warning. What once felt like emotional control turns into regret. What once felt like distance for safety turns into emotional emptiness. And what once felt like protection starts to feel like loss. They begin to wish they had stayed. They wish they had responded differently. They wish they had not confused fear with certainty. They wish they had allowed themselves to stay open instead of closing off every time things got emotionally real. Because silence teaches them something they avoided for a long time. They didn't lose the empath because the empath stopped caring. They lost them because they never fully showed up for the connection that was being offered. And that realization becomes the emotional turning point. It reveals the cost of their fear, the price of their distance, and the weight of the emotional opportunities they didn't take. What they lose is not just a person, but someone who offered consistency, care, forgiveness, and emotional presence without needing perfection in return. As they sit longer with that truth, something slowly becomes impossible to ignore. What they once called distance was never real protection. It only felt like protection in the moment. In reality, it was erosion happening quietly over time, not in one dramatic moment, not in a way that was obvious, but slowly, in small emotional decisions. Every time they pulled away instead of communicating, every time they shut down instead of staying present, every time they chose silence over vulnerability, it added up. Not loudly, but steadily. And because nothing broke instantly, they convinced themselves nothing was breaking at all. That is the part they fail to notice until it is too late. Distance does not always destroy something quickly. Sometimes it weakens it so gradually that both people think it is still stable, even while the emotional foundation is slowly disappearing underneath. So when the empath finally goes silent, it feels like something sudden has happened. But in truth, the silence is not sudden. It is the result of everything that came before it. Silence becomes the moment where all distractions disappear. There is no emotional back and forth anymore, no explanations to focus on, no reassurance to rely on, no conflict to react to, no comfort of believing it will go back to normal. That is why it feels so powerful to them. Not because silence itself is strong, but because everything that used to cover up emotional reality is gone. Silence becomes the final teacher because it removes every layer of denial they were standing on. It strips away the narratives they used to survive emotionally. The idea that they are better off alone, the belief that detachment equals strength, the assumption that not feeling deeply means not getting hurt. All of that stops working in silence. And what remains is something far more direct: reality. In that state, they are no longer reacting to the empath. They are left alone with themselves. And for the first time in a long time, there is nothing external to absorb the emotional weight they avoided processing. Every moment they withdrew, instead of engaging, starts to return in memory. Every situation where they could have been present but chose distance instead. Every opportunity for connection that was quietly refused. Not as accusations, but as understanding forming in hindsight. Avoidant patterns are built on the idea that stepping back prevents emotional pain. It creates a sense of control. It creates distance from discomfort. It feels like safety in the moment. But what they don't realize is that avoidance does not remove emotional pain. It only delays it. It pushes it forward in time, where it eventually accumulates. And when the empath becomes silent, that delayed emotional experience finally arrives all at once. Not in the form of punishment, not as revenge, not as someone trying to make them suffer, but as clarity that can no longer be avoided. That distinction matters. Irreality could no longer be avoided. And in that space, they finally recognize something they were not ready to see before. What ended the connection was not a single moment of loss. It was the accumulation of every moment they chose distance over connection, until connection no longer had anything left to hold on to. And that is why silence, in the end, stops feeling like emptiness. It starts feeling like truth.